The small town of Miller's Creek had always been quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, and secrets were hard to keep. But for all its simplicity, there was one story that never quite faded, one tale that lingered like the scent of roses after a storm, the story of Lila Hartley, the ghostly lover who sent Valentine's Day cards from beyond the grave. It all began in the winter of 1923. Lila was a young woman, bright and full of promise, with auburn hair that shone like fire in the sunlight and a smile that could light up the darkest room. She had fallen in love with a man named Thomas, a farmer's son who had worked the land his entire life. Their love was simple, but it burned with the kind of passion that everyone around them envied. In a town like Miller's Creek, where everyone's lives seemed to follow the same predictable pattern, their love was the exception. Lila and Thomas spent every moment they could together. Their love was the talk of the town, with even the most hardened hearts softening at the sight of them. But on a cold February morning, tragedy struck. Thomas was found in the barn, his body cold and lifeless, a victim of a farming accident. The whole town was shaken, but none more than Lila. They say she never recovered from the shock. She walked through her days like a ghost, her bright eyes dimming with each passing week. Every Valentine's Day, without fail, Lila would sit in front of her window, waiting for a letter, a sign, anything from Thomas. But there were never any letters. Not from him. Not from anyone. Weeks turned to months, and the town began to whisper about the strange things happening around Lila's house. It started small, flowers appearing on her doorstep, cards with no return address, notes written in an elegant hand, promising love from a secret admirer. But Lila never showed any interest. She would take the flowers, stare at the cards for hours, then place them on her mantel as if to keep them from disappearing. On Valentine's Day of 1924, something changed. That year, the card she received was different. It wasn't just any Valentine. It was sealed with an old wax seal, stamped with a symbol she had never seen before, a heart, broken in two, with an intricate line running through the center. The handwriting was familiar, but there was something about it that felt off. It wasn't Thomas's handwriting, but it looked like his. Almost as if his hand had guided the pen, but not in the way it used to. The message inside was short but haunting. "I'm waiting for you, Lila. Come join me, and we'll never be apart again." The card was signed simply, T. Lila was shaken, but her love for Thomas had never truly left her. She kept the card close, as though it were a lifeline. Days turned into weeks, and more cards began to arrive, each one more intimate, more personal than the last. They spoke of things only Thomas could know, secret places they had visited, memories they had shared. But still, she couldn't understand how he could be writing to her. He was dead. She had buried him herself. As the years passed, the cards kept coming, each Valentine's Day more elaborate than the last. The people of Miller's Creek began to wonder if Lila was losing her mind, if the grief had driven her to believe in something that wasn't possible. But then, something happened that no one could explain. It was Valentine's Day once again, this time in 1930. Lila had grown older, her once vibrant beauty now softened by the years of waiting. Her house, which had once been the symbol of love and life, now stood dark and cold, a place frozen in time. That night she sat in her chair, holding the latest card she had received, when something incredible happened. The air in the room grew cold. So cold that she could see her breath form in front of her. The lights flickered, and then, suddenly, the door creaked open. But no one stood there. No one had entered. And yet Lila heard the familiar sound of footsteps. She turned, eyes wide with disbelief. Standing at the foot of her bed was Thomas. He looked the same as he had the last time she saw him, tall, dark, and handsome, his face bathed in the soft glow of the candlelight. But there was something different about him. His eyes were hollow, as if they had seen too much, felt too much, in the years since his death. His clothes were not the ones he had been wearing when he died. They were strange, old-fashioned, like something out of another time entirely. "Lila," he whispered, his voice thick with the same love she had always known. "I've missed you. You were never meant to be without me," she gasped, stumbling back as he reached out toward her. But just as quickly as he had appeared, he vanished, like smoke, fading into the night. The house was silent again. Lila, trembling, turned toward the card she had been holding. The words on the page were different now, almost glowing with an ethereal light. "I've come for you. The time is now." The handwriting was no longer elegant, but jagged, as if written in haste. And the signature, once T, now read Thomas, but not quite. That night, Lila couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, waiting for the dawn, waiting for the impossible to make sense of itself. She knew something was wrong. She knew the spirit of Thomas was no longer just a ghost of memory. He had returned, but in a form that defied everything she understood about life and death. But why? Why was he calling her? What did he want? The lines between love and obsession had blurred, and she was standing in the center of it. It wasn't long before the town began to notice. People spoke in hushed tones about the ghostly lover who sent Valentine's Day cards from the other side. Some believed it was a trick, a cruel hoax. But others, those who had known Lila and Thomas, whispered that perhaps there was something to the story. Maybe Thomas's love had never truly left. Maybe he had found a way to return. The more cards Lila received, the more she became consumed by the mystery. Every year, she waited for the next Valentine's Day, hoping that this time, the truth would be revealed. But as the years wore on, she began to question if she could ever truly be with Thomas again, or if the cards would continue to haunt her forever. And every year, as the days grew shorter and the fog rolled in over Miller's Creek, Lila sat at her window, watching, waiting, knowing that Thomas was out there somewhere, sending his love from the beyond. But deep down, she couldn't shake the thought, was Thomas still the man she had loved? Or was he something else now, something that had crossed a line too far for even her to understand? As the years passed, Lila grew older, and the cards kept coming, each one more mysterious than the last. No one knew when it would end, if it ever would. But one thing remained certain: Lila would always be waiting for her ghostly lover, sending him her heart, and waiting for him to send his Valentine from the other side. The years had passed, but Miller's Creek had never forgotten the story of Lila Hartley, the woman who sent Valentine's Day cards to her ghostly lover. The town had changed, sure, but the haunting love story remained etched in its heart. The ghostly lover who had crossed the line between life and death. No one could explain it, but they all felt it. Lila had grown older, her auburn hair now grayed, her once bright eyes dulled by the weight of years spent waiting. She no longer sat by the window every night, waiting for a sign, a card, or a visitor. But she never stopped believing that Thomas, her lost love, would return for her. There was something in the air, an unspoken promise that haunted her every breath. But as the years wore on, the visits from Thomas grew less frequent. The cards stopped coming. And for the first time, Lila felt something she hadn't before, an unsettling emptiness that gnawed at her heart. She was starting to wonder if Thomas had truly gone, if maybe his love had been just a memory, a shadow that had finally faded into the mist. It was February 14th once again, but this time, something was different. Lila hadn't received a card. Not even a single flower. Her house felt emptier than it ever had before, and for the first time in years, she didn't sit by the window, waiting. She didn't have the strength. But when night fell, the doorbell rang. Lila jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. She slowly walked toward the door, hesitant, her hand shaking as she reached for the doorknob. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation. She opened the door slowly, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing on the doorstep, was a man. His appearance was familiar, but she couldn't place him at first. His features were soft and indistinct, like a blurry dream. His eyes, however, were the same piercing blue she had remembered, the same eyes that had once held her heart. Lila's breath caught in her throat. "Thomas?" she whispered. The man smiled, but it was a smile that was both warm and unsettling. There was something wrong with it, something that made her skin crawl, but she couldn't pull her eyes away. It was him, but not him. He had returned, but he was different. "Lila," the man said softly, "I've come back for you. After all these years, we'll finally be together." Her heart raced, and for a moment she felt the stirrings of hope rising within her. She stepped forward, ready to embrace him, but then a cold draft swept through the door, chilling her to the bone. Something about the air shifted, like a veil had lifted, revealing the truth. "Wait," she whispered, pulling back. "You're not him, are you?" The man's smile faded, his face twisting with an almost sorrowful expression. "What do you mean, Lila? I've always been yours. You know that." Lila took a step back, suddenly feeling the weight of the years that had passed, the years spent waiting for a ghost to return. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she saw it, the emptiness behind them. There was no warmth, no life. Just cold, dead space. "You're not Thomas," she said, her voice trembling. "You're something else." The figure sighed, his form flickering like a candle flame in the wind. "I am Thomas, Lila. I have always been Thomas, but you should know by now, love doesn't always stay the same. We're not who we once were." The air in the room grew colder, and the shadows around them seemed to shift, twisting into unnatural shapes. Lila's pulse quickened as she took a step back, her mind racing. She had waited for him all these years. She had loved him, believed in him. But this? This was no longer love. This was something else. "You were gone," Lila said, her voice trembling with grief. "You were dead. And now you're here, but not as you were. Not as I remember you." The man before her took a slow, deliberate step forward, his form beginning to distort, his face flickering between Thomas's familiar features and something grotesque. "You opened the door, Lila. You brought me back." "No!" Lila cried out, shaking her head. "I didn't, I couldn't." "But you did," the man continued, his voice low and chilling. "You sent your love to me. You sent your soul. And now, I have returned to claim it. To claim you." The walls around her seemed to close in, the shadows pressing against her. She turned, but there was nowhere to run. The house, the town, everything she had known seemed to fade away, replaced by an oppressive darkness. She could hear whispers, low and guttural, drifting through the house like wind through the cracks. Lila stumbled backward, her hand gripping the edge of the doorframe. "Thomas, please!" she cried. "I just wanted you back. I loved you, Her voice faltered as the figure before her began to change, its body twisting and contorting, no longer human, no longer anything recognizable. The air around her grew thick with a suffocating presence, like a weight that pressed down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. The figure's voice came again, more distorted now. "You should have known, Lila. The door between us is not so easily closed. Love, when it crosses the line between life and death, leaves a mark. And you are marked. As am I." Lila's heart pounded as she backed away, feeling the walls of the house pressing closer, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was trapped. Trapped in a love that had crossed the boundary between the living and the dead, and now she was paying the price. The figure lunged at her, its form no longer resembling Thomas, but something monstrous, something that had been twisted by the forces of death. Lila screamed, but the sound was drowned by the heavy thudding of her heart. The last thing she saw was the shape closing in on her, its form swallowing her whole, before everything went black. Story ends here, with Lila's fate sealed in the dark embrace of her ghostly lover. The love that once filled her heart has now become her curse, and the line between life and death has forever blurred. But even in death, the story isn't over. The shadows that haunt Miller's Creek are far from finished. What will happen next? The answers remain locked in the mystery of a love that never truly dies.